But I want to commend the foundation, and when Denise and I were talking, I've looked at what you're doing at the foundation, and what's significant to me is that as you think about connecting with others in the community, K through 12, and the teachers, and the Department of Education, and you focus on improving achievement. That's the point. Can we teach people to read well, to solve problems, to want to learn? If we could know that every child knew how to read, began to enjoy to read, began to solve math problems, and had a lust for learning, our jobs would be done. It sounds so simple. And yet we're having the greatest challenge, increasing graduation rates, improving the substance, the quality of the education for these students. And so the question becomes, what do we need to do in general about education, and particularly, what are the issues involving underrepresentation in science? I was recently invited to serve as the chair of a National Academies Committee that had people from the Dean of Harvard College to professors from MIT, from Stanford, to people from Hispanic-speaking institutions in Texas, from HBCUs, from Florida A&M and Howard. And the job we had was to figure out, how does it happen that we haven't talked about this question of competitiveness, global competitiveness, in relationship to the diversity, the growing diversity in our country? Some of you know the Rising Above the Gathering Storm report, and there, quite frankly, Norm Augustine did a superb job in talking about the need to invest in science at the basic level, including and apply, to have many more teachers. The study called for 10,000 more math and science teachers per year. The study also showed that only 6% of Americans who are 24 in our country hold degrees in natural sciences and engineering, compared to about 12% in Europe and to 70%, for example, in Korea. At a time when the science and technology infrastructure of the world will require much more science and engineering when thinking about everything from defense, intelligence, healthcare, environment, energy. And the question is, how do we increase those numbers? Well, what that first report did not do was to look at the impact of this increasing percentage of Hispanics, of blacks, of minorities in our community, knowing that very soon the underrepresented groups underrepresented in STEM areas will represent about 40% of Americans. At the same time that generally only 11% of Hispanics in the country over 25 have college degrees, and 17% of blacks, and only, quite frankly, 32% of whites. So we've got two issues to deal with. How do we increase the number of Americans in general, especially for low-income kids of all types, and then students of color? And then how do we have more of them doing well enough in science to succeed? Now, one of the reasons our campus has gotten such an amazing review by people is that it is a place that looks like what America will be more and more. We have students from 150 countries. We have the international diversity and the domestic diversity. We've got a lot of students we're the net importer of professors' kids from our system, quite frankly, and a lot of professors from Hopkins, because we have the highest percent who go to grad school, 40-some% go to grad school. Perhaps two statistics will make the point. We have a special program for minority kids, underrepresented groups, and it hasn't been a big, it's about 300 students at most out of our 10,000 undergraduates. But several years ago, there were only 67 biochemistry bachelors in the country produced or earned by African Americans, 67, which is sad within itself, but 22 came from my campus. And all of them went to grad and professional school. Several years ago, we had 12 kids to get interviewed at the Harvard Medical School. About 5 of them for MD PhDs, and half of them were minorities. And so people got the point, we must be doing something right. And we've done so well with the minority piece, and I'll talk a moment about what that means, that my white students said, we want the same thing. What is it that we did? We started focusing much more on building community among the students. We had to think about the issue of culture change on the campus. What do I mean? Well, the fact is that most Americans of all races who begin with a major in science and engineering change their majors within the first year or two. Watch this. How many of you know somebody who began college in pre-med and within a year or two changed the majors? Let me see your hands, pre-med or engineering. It's an American phenomenon. We just know it happens all the time. Now, typically what we in universities say, particularly those of us in STEM areas, is, well, it's the K through 12 issue. They're not well prepared. In fact, when I think about this education continuum, the reason I've spent so much time with school boards around the country and looking at different types of schools, from Andover in Massachusetts to the Illinois School for Math and Science, North Carolina School for Math and Science, to looking at community colleges and looking at 4 years, is to try to understand how do we break down the boundaries, the silos, when looking at every segment of this continuum. And I think college presidents, and my fellow college president will appreciate this, need to be as interested in and concerned about kindergarten as we are about undergrad or doctoral education, because they're so connected. And amazingly, when looking at the reasons students don't do well, K through 12 is an issue we have to talk about, yes, but recent study from UCLA corroborated what the National Academy study entitled Expanding Minority Participation. You can look at that study that came out. It said that the higher the SAT of the student, the more selective the university. Listen carefully. The greater the probability the student who begins in science will leave science within the first year or two. Let me say it again because it sounds counterintuitive. The higher the SATs, more AP credits in STEM, the more selective the university, the greater the probability the student will leave science. Now, the answer initially given when you ask students, why did you leave, is, I'm better in this other area. Well, if you get an A in the other area and you got a C or D in science, of course you'll feel like, I want to go to the other area. Because excellent students don't want C's. And yet, if you ask professors in any of our institutions, typically the answer is, that's about right, that most people will leave. Again, 20% of blacks and Hispanics, 32% of whites make it, and 42% of Asian Americans. Let me ask you globally one final question. How many of you believe there are many more brilliant Chinese and Indian children than American children? Usually Americans say, how could you even ask that? Aren't you an American? What's wrong with you? Well, I'm not asking a politically incorrect question. I'm asking a mathematical question. The fact is there are 1.3 billion Chinese, 1.1 billion Indians. You put those two together, you have 2.4 billion people. Now, the top 10% of any population from Nigeria or from America will be extraordinary. What's 10% of 2.4 billion? 240 million people. How many people does America have? 300 million. So those two countries have almost as many geniuses as we have citizens. Think about it. Now, and so if you go to anybody's, I'm sure at Brown, if you come to my campus in engineering, most of the people will be from those countries. And the other part is that even at the undergraduate level, more and more the kids who make it in our country have parents from other countries. Whether black, white, whatever the group is. And one of our challenges is to make sure I continue to get some of the black kids who are with grandparents from America, quite frankly, because and it has to do with culture of the country, and then we get to culture of the institutions. If you think about it, many of the Nobel laureates in our country across disciplines grew up, throughout the 20th century, grew up in New York. Parents did not speak English well. They came from European countries. They went to the poor man's Harvard, City College, Brooklyn College, and they went right to the top. Why? The hunger for the knowledge and appreciation of being in this country where you can get a reasonably priced education and be the best. Well, the vision for my campus is you don't have to be rich to be brilliant. There's an assumption in our country, without ever saying it, that the most privileged people will go to the very best institutions, which tend to be private, especially in New England, and therefore, you'll have a few scholarship kids, but therefore the most privileged will be the very best. Now, I think it's wonderful for people to have had the opportunity to go to the best institutions. I simply believe that as Americans, we should want public and private institutions to be among the best. And that we should want working class and low-income kids and middle-class kids to also aspire to be the very best intellectually.